Good afternoon, Alloa. So we're going to start our second session, and I'd like to introduce our panel on women's spaces. First of all, Rhona Hotchkiss, a former prisoner governor and famous to everyone, and now trustee of LGB Alliance. Kate Barker, the current CEO of LGB Alliance. And Anne-Marie Ward, the CEO of Favour UK, the addiction, advocacy and recovery charity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that wee cheer. That was very heartwarming. I just wanted to say something first about these things on your table. When I first saw it, I thought it was a bar of soap. So, as a Glaswegian, I was bloody terrified. Now I'm just insulted because I'm a Glaswegian. Anyway, fantastic things, but there we go. I've just got a prepared thing to say. Unusually, I'm going to read from a prepared script, because I had to send it to Alloa Women First for the press. Okay, so, in the 6 or 7 years since Women First started to shine a light on the practice of allowing males to self-identify into women's prisons, what's changed? The truth is, sadly, little that makes a material difference to women in prison. Some politicians have come on side, some like the wonderful Joan McAlpine and Caroline McAllister were on side from the start. Still others are sticking to the be kind approach, and the lunatic fringe are still sticking rigidly to the acceptance without exception mantra. The increasingly unhinged and controversial transgender charities Stonewall and the Scottish Trans Alliance demand adherence to that, as you know. Interestingly, and I know Kate's from LGB Alliance, so am I, we've gone from being the hate group to just the gay rights charity, while Stonewall have gone to being controversial, which is excellent for us. So the Isla Bryson debacle, which has already been mentioned this morning, was a moment of hope wrapped in a farce for me. When Hamza Yusuf declared him, for he is a he, to be at it, and even the outgoing, and I've actually written first manager here instead of first minister, for someone that could manage her way out of a wet paper bag, that's interesting. But anyway, when she couldn't even stumble to the end of a complete sentence in defence of Bryson being a woman, it seemed that the situation might be about to improve. When the Scottish Prison Service, after a public outcry, went back to the drawing board on their trans management policy, we hoped that it might at least match the policy of the Ministry of Justice in England. Their practice says that no intact males and no males at all with a history of violence against women will be placed in women's jails. But the Scottish Prison Service couldn't even manage that. They have not banned either. It's still open day on women's prisons. Instead, the Scottish Prison Service have said that even males who have committed violent and sexual offences against women will be considered for placement in women's prisons. They're hiding this outrage behind risk assessment. And as someone who was involved in risk assessment for years as a governor in charge, I can tell you that there is no rational risk assessment process in the world that can tell you that a multiple rapist or a murderer of women can ever be safe to live alongside them. The Chief Executive of the Scottish Prison Service said she could not imagine a situation where that could happen, where they would approve someone like that to go to the women's estate. Well, they gave it a damn good try with Adam Graham. But why allow the possibility at all, if you can't imagine it ever happening? It's been justified on the grounds that a blanket ban on all males who identify as women, or shockingly, even all of them who have been violent towards women, can't be defended. This is, of course, nonsense. The EHRC has been clear that it's entirely possible to exclude all males from any situation, where to do so could be considered a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, for example, privacy or safety, Where is that made more manifest than in a women's prison? The Scottish Prison Service didn't even consider this, but that should come as no surprise in their evidence document of 100+ pages, where trans rights are mentioned multiple times, almost on every page. Guess how many times women's rights is mentioned? Not once. Not once. That's how seriously they took this. They also conducted a survey as part of their evidence gathering with women in prison, with men in prison, with people who identify as trans, and with staff. I'm only going to touch on the women in prison bit here. I would like to talk more about what staff say, but they only spoke to 3 frontline staff, so I can hardly call it a representative sample, and it certainly doesn't represent the views of staff that are sent to me on a monthly and weekly basis. But the results are surprising, and it's taken me a while to kind of take them in and process them. Contrary to the previous work, which they never released, but which the wonderful Marion Scott of the Sunday Post did release and publicise. And while I'm on Marion Scott, one of the best investigative journalists Scotland has, and she has a decades-long tradition of doing this on behalf of women, Marion's next campaign will be around getting recognition and justice for women, many of them whom now in their 80s, many who died with the shame of that still holding on to them, who were forced to give up their own children for adoption. I hope when Marion launches that campaign, you'll all feel you can get behind her. But surprisingly, this latest survey showed that the previous research showed that a majority, about 80% of women surveyed, were opposed in one way or another, for one reason or another, to men who identify as women sharing their spaces. This time the results were a lot more equivocal. So the responses to the questions asked, and of course it's possible to ask further questions about the questions asked, but about 60% were broadly in favour of men who identify as women sharing their spaces, when you exclude the don't knows depending on the question. However, 71% of women who were asked said that if a man only starts to identify as trans during their sentence, and I would add post-arrest, there's that justice onset dysphoria thing, they should stay in the male estate. It's a thing, justice onset dysphoria, I'm convinced. They should stay in the male estate. So 70% of women asked don't want these men in the estate beside them. Have the prison service taken that on board? Have they hell? And Ash Regan's doing a fantastic job for us, by the way, raising these questions in Parliament. Absolutely excellent. I'm only saying that because she's sitting right at the front, looking daggers at me. She's got a hot drink in her hand. However, this means, though, that the Chief Executive of the Scottish Prison Service based her awful remark in Parliament that women just want to be kind, and you could hear an audible gasp and see people going behind her as she said it, on the views of about 35 women in prison out of the near 300 that are there. Never mind her unawareness of the cultural conditioning of women to be kind and to centre men's demands has dominated this whole vile scenario from the start. It's also worth noting, I think, that the female prison population doesn't reflect the female population outside of prison in all of its demographics. It's younger, for a start. And I'm really heartened to see so many young women here today. I count anybody under 60 in that bracket. No, but it really is. It's great to see so many young women. I was quite convinced the hall would heat up quite quick, given the age of most of the women here. But I do think we've got a huge, huge job as women who care about these issues to support young women speaking out, because they've got an awful lot more than us to lose. I don't have to care about my job anymore. I don't give a toss about losing friends. Most of my family support me. But I'm just lost in admiration for young women who speak out about all of this. So we seem to have reached a bit of a stalemate with what's happening with women in prison, and I don't quite know what to do next, and I'm hoping that we might, between us, get some answers today. But I just want to remind you that in among all of that apparent positivity in the survey that the Scottish Prison Service did, there were still women saying, I'm raging, I'm irritated, I'm pissed off, and for me, I'm afraid. There are still women saying that. I may not know what to do next, but I'm not ready to walk away from these vulnerable women yet. I'm going to keep standing up for women in prison, and I just want to say, will you stand with me? So I want to welcome next Kate Barker. Kate is my friend and colleague at, what's it called again? Oh yes, LGB Alliance, and she's travelled all the way up from that London to take part, so be kind to her, Kate.
Thank you, thank you. I mean, just before I start, I want to say how fantastic it is to be here, how flattered I am to be invited. I love all these tables, it's brilliant, people spreading ideas, there's such a sense of love and warmth. It's a brilliant event. On my way up here, I did receive some unwelcome news via text, which was that the heating wasn't working at the Airbnb I was at. So I'm also really here just to be glad in the warm for the day. So, if I'm honest. The first time I stood up in front of a group of people and talked about carving out spaces for lesbians and for gay people, I was at university and I was 18, and I was trying to persuade everybody that we had to have a gay society because we didn't have one. And all I can remember about it was that I was absolutely terrified, but I remember looking out at this sort of sea of faces, and there was a lot of curiosity because it wasn't that common to be out and to be standing up when you were in the mid-80s. But also, it was just a kind of a befuddlement and a mild bemusement, because although people had an idea what a gay man was, even if it was wrapped up in stereotypes, they weren't really sure what lesbians were and what they were all about. And that was reflected by the fact that at my time in university, very often, a man would kind of sidle up to me, and I always knew what was coming, and he would sidle up and kind of smile and smirk a bit, and he'd say, oh, I think I'm a lesbian too. Now, of course, everybody that I was with, gay or straight, they would just roll their eyes and they would think it was absolutely ridiculous, and of course, that the man that said it was a complete idiot. It's all changed in the last 4 decades, clearly, because now, if a man sidles up to you and says he's a lesbian, the world does not roll its eyes. The world says he's stunning and brave. And if you're brave enough to stand up and say, he's an idiot, you'll find yourself called up in front of HR, accused of being insufficiently inclusive. And if you're in a sports club or a hobby group, you'll be kicked out of it. And if you're a writer or an artist or a performer, you will be banished from society so that you can't make a living. And if you're a lesbian and you're on a dating app, you will be booted off it. And most chillingly, here in Scotland, somebody will be popping along to a sex shop and reporting you for a hate crime. And I think my 18-year-old self would have been pretty astonished by that turn of events. So at LGB Alliance, we do think a lot about the importance of language and the meaning of words, and I think that's central for all of us, not just for lesbians, but for all of us to this struggle. Because if we're forbidden the use of the words that accurately describe ourselves and our unique experience of being in the world, then we are stripped of the ability to be able to point out or fight back against the discrimination that we face. And language is flexible, of course, but at the moment, the meaning of words has been appropriated, and then their meaning is distorted, and they're turned back on us to hurt us. There's one word that we'll die in a ditch over at LGB Alliance, and it is the word lesbian. That's why it's so profoundly shocking and disturbing to us that the organisations that once existed to support us, the organisations that we trusted, are the authors of this linguistic assault on us. Now, I'm sure, I'm talking specifically, of course, about Stonewall in this instance, who've been redefining the meaning of the word lesbian since 2015 when they came up with the idea of adding the T onto the LGB. Now, bear in mind they're a gay rights organisation, so in order to make sense of that, they had to redefine homosexuality as an attraction to the same gender and not to the same sex, the sole purpose of which was to allow heterosexual men, husbands, fathers, to be able to cross-dress as women, call themselves women, and therefore be lesbians. And it's an opportunity for them to indulge their fetish, and lesbians in particular have been thrown under the bus for that particular cause. I mean, needless to say, lesbians haven't been consulted on this crackpot, postmodernist mangling of language that's brought about for no reason except to let men indulge their fetish. Nancy Kelly. I don't like to call out individuals sometimes because it feels a bit pointed, but I think Nancy Kelly, the ex-CEO of Stonewall, is an abhorrent person who has brought hell raining down on the lives of so many people that she was meant to be supporting. And she said, and this is a quote from her, "If you find that when dating, you are writing off entire groups of people, like people of colour, fat people, disabled people, or trans people, then it's worth considering how societal prejudices may have shaped your attractions." She was talking about lesbians in this case. So she was saying not being attracted to trans women, aka men, I think we can all agree on that, is a prejudice. Being a lesbian is a prejudiced position. And it's such a reminder of back in the 80s of that you just haven't found the right bloke yet, and all the silly straight blokes saying that they were really lesbians. And to hear this coming out of the mouth of somebody that's in charge of the biggest charity in Europe that's meant to be supporting our rights is just really, really horrifying. And this redefinition of the word, it's raced through businesses and charities, and it's through the police, it's through the judiciary, of course it's in the media. Nancy Kelly and Stonewall are the reason why they're sheeing and herring men putting cats in blenders and raping women. You know, they've directly caused this. And it's interesting to note as well that, I don't know if any of you followed our court case, where, Mermaids and the LGBT consortium tried to have the LGBT Alliance's charitable status removed because for lots of reasons, but really they just hated us and feared us. So originally it was Mermaids and the LGBT consortium that brought the action. But on the day that it was announced, Stonewall was also on that list. Press release went down about 90 seconds later, went back up again, and Stonewall was removed. So they were clearly involved in the original work around that, but just at the last minute thought, it's not going to be good for our brand going after a small charity. But don't think for a second that they weren't behind it and the architects of that attack on us. So anyone that followed brilliant tribunal tweets will remember the moment when Kate Harris was just reduced to sort of desperate and furious tears by the suggestion of the barrister that she was being unkind not to admit that a lesbian could have a penis. It's such an absolutely absurd position, and this theft of our language has a lot of real-world consequences for people. So I don't know if anybody knows Jenny Watson or remembers the name Jenny Watson. So she was running a speed dating event for lesbians in London, and she'd been doing it for a few years. Where? Right, stand up. Woo-hoo! Stand up. Come on. Up. Come on. Hey! Woo! Didn't see you over there. Should come and say hello. So, well, Jenny got in touch with us because she'd been running a lesbian speed dating event. It was really successful over a number of years in a London pub, and she'd had lots of, relationships. There'd been a couple of civil partnerships and engagements and heartbreak and everything that goes on at these events. And then one day a guy turned up, and they felt pretty awkward about this, didn't know what to do about it. And then a different guy came along, and he was wearing a purple latex outfit and had a visible erection. It was really upsetting. You go to a lesbian speed dating event, you pretty much expect to be dating lesbians and not a guy. It seems self-evident, but not to these people. So she was forced to put a note on her website, and it said, this is an event for lesbians. If you're a man, you're not a lesbian, please don't come. And then all hell broke loose for her. So the trans activist contacted the pub where she was holding the event and said it was transphobic and it must close. They contacted the ticketing app where she sold her tickets and had her account closed down. They wrote to her employer, a local authority, and said that she was a transphobe, so that she was called up in front of HR and an investigation was launched. And they found her address and they sent her threats that she would be murdered and gang raped. Can we just pause for a second and think about the absurdity of a situation where a woman and a lesbian trying to defend a social evening has to convince people that a man is not a lesbian? It would have seemed absurd just a few years ago, but those are the impacts that we're feeling. And this insidious redefining of the word lesbian to mean someone who is exclusionary. I mean, categories are exclusionary because that's how they work. But someone who is prejudiced, someone who is unkind, someone who is bigoted, and generally an unsavoury and a distasteful person, which is driven by Stonewall and all of the LGBTQ plus organisations who've been captured by gender ideology. And the effect on young girls and young women is really horrifying too, and that really concerns us at LGBT Alliance. So we get lots of emails from worried parents, and here's one of them. So this mum says, my daughter, 14, is in desperate need of counselling. She's lesbian, her words and declaration, not mine. She suffers the most awful homophobic bullying at school, is regularly called faggot, and has children who make noises like, ooh, each time she walks past them. Occasionally, it's mildly physical. The school bus is like the Wild West. She's one of those kids who lies awake playing things over and over in her head. She's self-harmed at least once. She's lonely, not without friends, but without friends like her. All the other kids at the LGBTQ club at school are trans, literally all of them. She's the only lesbian, and I know she thinks it would be easier if she says she's at least non-binary. I'm at a loss. She's at risk. Can you help? So we are doing our best to help at LGBT Alliance, and it's letters like these and contacts like these which really drive us. So we're supporting lots of young women in the workplace, many behind the scenes, some more publicly, who are being targeted at work in social spaces, online spaces, and in the wider community. We're also working to split the LGB from the TQ+. The TQ+ is a lobby group that explicitly hurts same-sex attracted people, but most of all lesbians. They're absolutely pernicious. We're also supporting girls because they're disproportionately represented at gender clinics. And we've campaigned consistently against puberty blockers and affirmation-only medical services. So we were really happy to hear that puberty blockers won't be prescribed by the NHS in England. We're hoping that the same will happen in Scotland. It's been a bit of a step backwards recently with an announcement yesterday about cross-sex hormones, but we're trying to understand what's happened there. But also, we want to make sure that any private clinics and online organisations like the absolutely awful Gender GP have the same restrictions as an NHS doctor as well. So kids can't just go online and order these drugs. And I'm also pleased to let you know that an exciting piece of news, and I can just see the head of operations there looking at me. I know she's going to say, what are we told them that for? Anyway, that a soft launch of our LGB helpline for young people is imminent. So that's happening very, very soon. So we've worked really hard on it. It's the only helpline of its type in the UK, unbelievably. It's run by lesbians, gay men and bisexuals who all believe in the reality of biological sex. And we hope it's going to be a resource that provides a positive view of LGBT people from LGBT people. And it's the beginning of our efforts to reclaim the word lesbian and to imbue it with a kind of a positivity and a joy and a sense of adventure, which it deserves, we think. Now, I was successful in setting up the Gay Society at university. It happened. Everybody voted for it. But I do profoundly regret that in all the years in between then and just a couple of years ago, I didn't say anything. I didn't speak up. I didn't feel I needed to. I was out at work. I could rely on all the work done by gay rights activists and lesbian activists in before me, and I had it pretty easy. I didn't feel disadvantaged, so I didn't say anything. There was even a brief window when being a lesbian was cool. I enjoyed that too. So I think the important thing to take away is that when this particular battle is won for us around gender and around the use of language, and I really believe that it will be won and that together we will win it, that we must not be complacent like I was and think, well, that's done then. That could never happen again. That thing that happened to me 40 years ago with men pretending they're lesbians, that will never happen again, because it will. So we need to, in good times and bad, still keep meeting, relying on each other's strength and insights and courage, because together I think we'll win and we'll keep on winning. So on that note, in which case I hope to see you next year. So thank you.
I also just want to give a wee plug to the fact that Kate is a novelist, and her first novel was, honestly, I bought it out of sympathy because I thought, that poor bugger. She'd probably only sell about 5, I better buy a couple. Honestly, it was my book of the year. What's it called again?
The Coldest Place on Earth.
No, honestly, it's a truly fabulous book. Rush out and buy it. It's available on Amazon. Okay. So our third panelist today, I'm absolutely delighted to have with us today, is Anne-Marie Ward. Lots of you know Anne-Marie because she's a loud and fearless voice on behalf of people who are still using substances but in recovery from alcohol and drug abuse. Anne-Marie has her own organisation. She's the chief executive of it. It's not always included in mainstream discussions about this subject in Scotland, but it certainly should be. So Anne-Marie is going to share some of her personal story here and talk about why single-sex spaces are important to her. Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks very much, ladies, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me here today. It is genuinely an honour and a privilege, so thank you for recognising the courage, that it takes to speak up in Scotland at the moment. So my name is Anne-Marie. I'm a person in long-term recovery from alcohol and other drug use, and I use that phrase very deliberately, alcohol and other drugs, because we've got this collective denial about alcohol, don't we, that it's not really that bad. I've been completely abstinent from all mind-altering substances for 27 years now, and I truly think that is both radical and revolutionary, and that if more people were to even attempt a month of abstinence, that we could change the whole situation in Scotland very deliberately and very quickly. I want to pick up on some of the points that have already been made around the linguistic assault that we're experiencing. I would go as far as to say Orwellian links. And I'm going to bring it into what we're experiencing in the addiction sector and the meaning of words being manipulated. So for instance, can I just tell you that for the most part, the investment in the addiction treatment sector goes into something called harm reduction interventions, which the industry calls treatment. So when most politicians, with the exception of a few here today, in particular Ash Reagan, when they speak about alcohol and drug treatment, the public hears, oh yeah, that's like helping people get off drugs and get off alcohol, and alcohol, you know, their dependency gets treated. But actually what alcohol and drug treatment means, for the most part in Scotland, is some sort of harm reduction intervention. So when you hear the word rehab now, and this is how far this linguistic assault has gone, rehab traditionally always meant that, you know, you went to a place, you got freedom from your dependency, and you learned, you know, you dealt with the various traumas or whatever it was that led to your dependence in the first place, but you got abstinence, basically. Now rehab means in Scotland, and generally in the past as well, if you were lucky enough to get a funded place, and there were very few, and still are very few, single-sex rehabs across the UK. There's one currently in Scotland that is run by a Christian organisation, Jericho House, down in Greenock, for women, which is excellent. If you were lucky enough to get funded, because usually it's only the rich that can go to rehab, the chances of you getting into a single-sex rehab were minuscule, despite the evidence base. And this is another piece of rhetoric that you'll hear from politicians in particular, or industry experts, where they'll talk about the evidence base. Now, the evidence base says that women and men do much better in treatment in single-sex services. So why are we not providing single-sex services? But coming back to the linguistic assault on rehab, rehab now means that you can go somewhere for 4 weeks in Scotland and you've been to rehab. Now, to me, that's a spin dry. You've been detoxed. You know, traditional rehab would be 12, 26, up to a year even of deep trauma and therapy work. Rehab can also mean now that you get stabilised on the drugs that you are currently using. So we've got these things called stabilisation centres and crisis centres now. So again, you know, redefining what rehab means. And I'd like to highlight, maybe get your tinfoil hat out for this one. I'd like to highlight what I believe is the connections between what's going on here. I think there are massive funding channels that go into sex workers' rights, drug users' rights, and trans rights organisations, and that actually this is a weaponisation of the rights agenda to the exclusion of women's rights. And I think one of the really good evidences of this is what we're seeing, the discussion in Scotland that's taking place around drug consumption rooms. So this is a really good example of how the evidence is being manipulated here. So in the past, and presently I would argue that drug consumption rooms are palliative care, that there's an evidence base for them, that they're, you know, when they were originally, the majority of the evidence comes from European countries where they have extremely high homeless populations. We don't have that in Scotland. Our homeless populations are growing, but we don't have it. But the main thing I'd like to highlight about this is that in these other European countries, they have 5 pillars that support their treatment system. They have prevention programs, treatment, which means actual abstinence and freedom from addiction, dissuasion, which is the police element, harm reduction, which is, the harm reduction interventions like clean needles, etc., which are vital, and reintegration into society. In Scotland, we only have harm reduction. We don't have any of the other 4 pillars. So to put in a drug consumption room in Scotland is palliative care. It's the same we've gave up. We also have a situation in Scotland whereby it's similar to the women's movement. We have many quangos in the addiction sector who are state-sponsored. 90% of their funding comes from the state, so they're government lobbying government, and they don't speak about any of the things that I'm raising here today. I just want to tell you, particularly from my own personal experience, especially hearing the speakers this morning, the women from Build a Girl, sorry, your name escapes me. Fiona, sorry. Fiona, I knew that fine well, sorry. My heart's pumping like lead here. My experience growing up was that I grew up in an alcoholic home. We were scared all the time. There was sexual and physical abuse happening all the time. School was a safe place for me. And when I got into recovery at the young age of 25, and I was spared a lot of the trauma that a lot of women face who become addicted to alcohol and other drugs. At the end of my using, I was working full time and using smack and crack, ladies. That happens. Your idea of what a addict looks like is probably stereotypical. The majority of the people that I got well with were completely functioning or putting on a front. I had a mask that it took me at least 2 years to strip away and to fall apart. And that was one of the big fears when I did enter into recovery, when I got my sponsor, and she was a psychodynamic and cognitive behavioural therapist, and she was also a childhood sexual abuse survivor. And I'd say to her, I'm so scared to do this work because I think I'm going to fall apart. And that mask had protected me for so long. And I did fall apart, and it was really, really good. I became really vulnerable, and I try and carry that vulnerability on my sleeve as well, because it offers me an opportunity to connect with people, and it also disarms people. So I'd say that vulnerability is a real strength. But what was absolutely vital to my ongoing healing was having women's groups, women-only groups. And I've been a member of those women's-only groups for over 20 years now, I didn't have the opportunity to go to rehab or anything like that. I got well in the anonymous fellowships, the mutual aid fellowships. They served me very, very well. And like I said, there was lots of very professional, educated women who were in there as well. They were not your stereotypical. I was very shocked actually when I went to anonymous fellowships at what those women looked like, because I was expecting the old guy in the park with the half bottle in his pocket, and that wasn't what I found. I found ordinary women like us, of all shapes and sizes, colours, creeds, sexualities, and I was very privileged to get access to that type of care, but having the absolute safety of a women-only group and having the freedom and the vulnerability to share without fear of being, judged or, my vulnerability being exposed was a major part of my healing, and I could not do that in settings where there were men. I didn't feel safe enough. I can now, do you know what I mean? I could talk till the cows come home now, in any setting, because I know I'm protected, so I just want to say, we've got a bill coming to Parliament, that the area of addiction, and it's going to become a much, much bigger topic in Scotland. There's a bill coming to the table in May called the Right to Recovery Bill, that myself and a guy called Stevie Wishart wrote. this bill would give, and you're going to hear a lot of misinformation about this bill, it would give people access to all the harm reduction interventions that I just mentioned. But crucially, and not only would it give them access to those harm reduction interventions, it would make them in law that any politicians coming forward in the future couldn't change that. So it would cement it in law. But crucially, it would give people access to services that they currently cannot get access to, which are traditional detox services and traditional rehab services. We've got probably one of the world's best rehabs in Scotland, Castle Craig down in Peebles. But Scottish people can't get access to it. It's full of Dutch. The Dutch government sends people over, and the reason why we can't get access to it is because our government won't fund it. And we've heard, if you followed this debate in any way, you know, we had a campaign in 2019 called You Keep Talking, We Keep Dying, which was born out of complete frustration at seeing only harm reduction interventions being offered in our services. And Nicola Sturgeon's government said, you know, they took their eye off the ball and that they would put £20 million a year into rehab. And you'll hear the politicians spout this out on a regular basis, but actually what that 20 million has meant has only, in the last 3 years, we've only seen a rise of 32 new rehab beds. Now you're going to hear stuff about drug checking services as well. My concern here about drug checking services and drug consumption rooms is that this is normalising drug use for our community, for our kids. Like you can take drugs safely. You can get your drugs checked to make sure that they're safe, and there is no safe way to take drugs, especially if you're vulnerable, and more so if you're a vulnerable young woman. You're going to be exposed, like Rhona said, you're going to be exposed to all sorts of people who will take advantage of that vulnerability, as I was. So please keep your eye open for the Right to Recovery Bill. I think there's a wee thing on your table that you can go to our website and you can link straight through to asking your MSP to support the bill. As I said, it would make, currently the rich get rehab and the poor get methadone. And if you could support this bill, it would mean an awful lot to a lot of vulnerable men and women, but particularly women, because it's so much harder for women to come forward for treatment in this area, so much harder. They've got so many more risks of losing their children. And in fact, I'll finish on this, Rhona, some of the women who do come forward and who do have their children taken from them, the research tells us that they are more likely to die of a drug overdose or an intentional suicide. The stats that we have from England, because our stats are an absolute mess, by the way. The Scottish stats are. We're going to do a seminar on Zoom, which will be live on Facebook, and I'll point it out on our Twitter feed on April the 15th. We've got a statistician and an analysis looking at our stats. They're so much worse. The drug death statistics are so much worse than what you're getting told they are, as are the alcohol deaths. And don't even get me started on MUP, the minimum unit pricing, debacle, because it is an absolute debacle. So please, there are so many people, apparently as many as 1 in 6 people in Scotland are in trouble with alcohol or other drug use. 1 in 10, so that 1 in 10 is probably alcoholic or addicted in some way. So, what you think an addict or an alcoholic looks like is probably wrong. So I'll leave it there, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much to Kate and Anne-Marie and me. We've got time for some questions, or as Julia said this morning, very helpful, comments as well. We don't mind comments as long as they're not too long-winded. Oh, we've got questions. Oh, we have questions. Yes, we can.
Take it to the floor. Catherine is at the back. That's Catherine there. She's got questions for you. She's got a mic on the table. Herding cats.
Step we gaily, on we go, heel for heel and toe for toe, arm and row, off for Mary's wedding. Oh, thank God, here she is.
List of questions, and there's
Okay.
also another one I wanted to ask that's not in here.
Okay.
Which I wanted to ask first, if that's okay.
Oh, she wants to ask one.
I'm going to ask a question that's not written down for the panel, which is the idea of physical v sort of psychological safety. So you often hear people saying that they feel, like for example, at Philia weren't allowed a space at the Welsh conference because people said they felt unsafe. But if I'm, as a woman, in a toilet with my knickers at my ankles and a man comes in, I am going to feel physically unsafe. So how can we dismantle this idea, like get back to the idea of what being unsafe actually means? It's not being uncomfortable, it's not being... Yeah, that was my question.
No, that's a great question, and I'll maybe respond first. And I know this is a pet hate of people like Joanne Lamont, who feel that thinking back 100 years ago when she was working and setting up women's organisations, when safety really meant something, and now safety means not being offended. So I'm passionate, but I think we all are, about reclaiming the idea of safety. We have to challenge it every other time we hear it. I think it's also linked, the word that really bugs me is progressive. How can it be progressive to allow men to break women's boundaries with impunity? We have to reclaim the word progressive. So there's two things for us to do as a result of being here today: reclaim safety, reclaim progressive. So this is one for Kate. So Kate, and it says, please say yes to this. Is Stonewall in its death throes?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's dying from the inside. You can tell by the fact that they're having real trouble recruiting senior staff like chief executive and chair of trustees and that kind of thing, because a few years ago people would have leapt at the idea to be chief executive of Stonewall. Amazing, all the kudos that came with it. You can see by their accounts as well that they're struggling, and they're very heavily staffed and very overburdened with office space. It's sort of technical stuff, quite boring, but you know, they've got a lot of costs and they've got a lot of outgoings and their incomings are going down. But more importantly, I think it's their reputation that has that's plunged. And having a good reputation can carry you a long way. But when it turns, and when you've suddenly gone from being the good guys in everything that you do to being an organisation that people kind of think is controversial, even though they don't know much about it, you're absolutely going to start to drown. And good riddance.
Okay, I'm going to direct this next question to Anne-Marie. You okay? Have you recovered from your shakes? What more can we do to encourage women to defend their boundaries, Anne-Marie?
Gosh. It's really hard for a lot of women to defend their boundaries, especially today, and I think especially for young women. I have to do it all the time. I recently had an experience where I was being told that, and because of my position, I had to think in a particular way. And I was like, really? You know, like, do I really have to think that, like, whatever the current zeitgeist is? Should I not be allowed my own opinion? You know, should I not be allowed my own thoughts? That was what was, you know, coming to me, that wasn't allowed as my, you know, because I have this, you know, title of CEO. So I think what women can do is just, you know, well, what we've done as Faces and Voices of Recovery is we've tried to own the space for lived experience. So we've tried to say to, you know, a lot of these quangos who would maybe manipulate and steer the lived experience voice, no, actually, this is the lived experience voice, and we get that through, you know, collating various surveys and experience and, you know, bringing people forward, asking people their actual opinion about various things. So to maintain boundaries is, learn what they are, because I never learned what they were. I grew up in an Irish Catholic home where I thought, there was this really mixed message of the men were all useless bastards. That was a phrase, right? They're all useless bastards. They're either at the bookies or the pub, and they're holding back in their wages. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so the men, a lot of the time, the men were unemployed. And then they walked into the house, or my granny's, or, wherever, and they were lifted and laid like kings and princes. They never even made a cup of tea. So I was in my 30s and 40s before I even learned what boundaries were. I was just there to serve. And actually, I'm still a practicing Catholic for my sins, no pun intended. And I think that idea of being of service is incredibly important to me, to the community that I'm trying to serve. But I think there's a boundary within that as well. That doesn't mean that you can walk all over me. It doesn't mean that I'm a doormat. And to stand up, raise your voice, even though your voice is fucking shaking and your heart is pounding as hard as mine is the now, just raise it and see what happens.
Just to add something about boundaries and connected to what we were saying about safe spaces, is another issue with safe spaces is that it becomes incumbent on women to prove that you're going to be raped or murdered, or you can't say no. It's not just about a toilet or a hospital ward being safe. It's about it being dignified, and I don't have to produce crime statistics or statistics of male violence to say, no, I say no, and I want it to be a single space, and that's that. So that worries me about safe spaces as well.
Okay, I'm going to put two questions together here. So, does the panel have examples of women who self-exclude from women's spaces because of TQIA demands, and how can we reclaim these spaces? So I'll kick off and then I'll pass on the panel. So I'll change my hats here and put on my Byres Place director's hat for a minute. Thank you. And the answer to do we have examples of women who self-exclude? Absolutely. Byres Place has now spoken to almost 2,000 women since we opened a year and a week ago, and we're currently working with 270 plus women. I say plus because it increases almost every day, so I don't know the exact numbers. And we will soon be able to produce figures on how many of these women have self-excluded because they couldn't be guaranteed a women-only space. So really concrete examples there.
We hear of people self-excluding all the time. So in a workplace, the LGBTQ plus network, lesbians, gay men and bisexuals don't go along to those anymore because they're completely run generally by straight cross-dressing men. People are excluding from the social scene, and we've set up, for example, a series of friends groups around the country, and all they are is get-togethers in a pub where like-minded people can chat like we are here and feel relaxed and able to say what they think. And the interest in those has been enormous, and that's because for gay people who are gender critical, i.e. who believe in biological reality, you have to be careful what you say. You can't go to places, and if you make your views public, you will be excluded. So people choose to self-exclude. So there's a lot of isolation and a lot of people feeling worried and lonely. We want to change that.
I think there's something about class in all this as well. So as a young woman, when I first got clean and sober, like Fraser's, the department, the makeup department and the fancy perfume and all that, I thought that was for real women. Like, my thinking was that was for real women, that wasn't for me. My self-esteem, like, people spoke about low self-esteem. I had no self-esteem because I'd been violated as a child. I was completely fragmented. I was of no value. So see the women that we're talking about that are in prison, and the women that are coming forward a lot of the time, the majority of the women coming forward for addiction treatment out with the private sector, the women who can't afford it. They're women like me who have no esteem. So that's why I'm saying the boundary question is so hard, because they've not got any boundaries. They don't know it's okay to say, I'd really like a single-sex space. So there's a massive consciousness-raising exercise needed here for women in few ordinary working-class communities, that you deserve a single-sex space. So I just want to reiterate that as well. Somebody said to me earlier, oh, you always look dead glamorous, Anne-Marie. I was 43 years old before I knew I was pretty. Right? Now, that's women who have been abused are coming from a place, and I'm not saying that we should all be worried about being pretty, right? But that is a value that society holds for women, and it was a value that I never even knew that. My esteem was so low. So what I'm saying is basically if women, we're having a conversation and I see this conversation being led by a lot of middle class women, and nothing against middle class women, there's a lot of conversations that can be amplified and raised through those avenues in the media in particular. But I think there's something about consciousness raising around ordinary working class women don't even know that they're allowed to ask for single sex spaces. We are allowed.
I think Anne-Marie's raised a really important point there about choice and self-esteem. And Anne-Marie was talking about the makeup counter at Fraser's, a foreign concept to me. But I think that hides an important point, because for me and women like me, my self-esteem and my choice is around not wearing makeup, not having to, not wearing women's clothes and not having to. So I think it is about empowering women, and it's about teaching women to recognise their own boundaries and their own needs and their own choices. I think it's a really powerful point. There's a question here about girls in the legal system. What about girls in young offenders institutions, secure units? And an interesting one at the end here on children's panels, which currently must have a mix, including women, but could this in the future, perhaps it is already, include trans women? Now, I'm actually going to set that one aside, because we've got For Women Scotland in the last panel, and I think that's a really relevant question for them in view of the court cases they've taken and the appeal that's ongoing, so I'm not going to ignore that. There's another one which was about the reduction in the public eye of women's single-sex spaces, but it also said about women's social single-sex spaces, and Sally Wainwright has spoken very eloquently on this. Oh, it's her question. Well, there you are, why. She got the microphone, so I'm going to hand over to Sally.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rhona. Kate was talking about language, and I think it's really, really important, because language, a lot of this trans nonsense has been about an assault on language and redefining words. So woman now means men, oppressive abusers now are the most marginalised and discriminated against individuals in the world. And I know this because Nicola Sturgeon told me so. So it must be true. And in fact, when I was having that conversation very, very briefly with Nicola Sturgeon, I tried to talk to her about men in women's spaces. And she immediately started talking about rapists in toilets. And I now refer to this whole movement as being about rapists in toilets. And the reason why it's perfectly okay for men to pretend to be women is because it's just bad actors, and rapists will get their way into women's toilets, whether they pretend to be women or not, and so on and so forth. But I think that there's a real problem, because we keep talking about safe spaces, and somebody mentioned social spaces, Rhona mentioned social spaces just now. And I just want to say how completely different and important social spaces are for lesbian women, and it's different than for those of you who aren't lesbians. Because non-lesbian women, is that heterosexual women, straight women, what's the right-on phrase nowadays? What am I allowed to say? Anyway, people who aren't lesbian. Women who aren't lesbian, you need safe spaces in particular circumstances. It's situational. You need a safe space when you need to go to the toilet. Some of you have heard me say this before, I know. You need a safe space if you're in a hospital ward. Some of these safe spaces are very, very important, but they're particular, and they're down to individual circumstances that mean that you require safe spaces. Whereas for lesbians, and Jenny's been doing some fantastic work trying to make this possible. For lesbians, we just want space. We just want women's space, lesbian space. We don't care about whether there's the man across the room's going to rape us or not. I mean, we do care if the man across the room's going to rape us or not. But I don't think that because there's men in this room, or there were earlier, that I'm physically in danger of being assaulted. But it's not a women's space if there's a man in the room. And if we're lesbians, we demand our right of association and our demand to be with the people that we want to be with and to be able to socialize. In Tasmania, the Supreme Court has ruled that lesbian women can't organize lesbian-only spaces because to do so would be to contravene the equalities legislation and be discriminatory. And that's where we're heading in this country now. Kate was mentioning about, men saying that they're lesbians. That is the official position of this Scottish government. The official position of the Scottish government is men can be lesbians as soon as they put on a skirt, metaphorically or literally. I think she wants me to stop talking. But anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sally.
John Nicholson thinks everybody can be a lesbian.
One last question here, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
It's a question for you, Rhona. You mentioned Bera's Place and what a wonderful privilege it is to have that. Will we have any more across other parts of the country?
So, obviously, this is something we've discussed. Joanne Lamott's here as well, Lisa, who's our comms person, and Susan, I think, is coming later. But our preferred future would be that other rape crisis services reclaim single-sex spaces.
Yes!
We hope we're in a unique position because, for some reason, I can't remember why, we don't have to care about funding. But it's a very real threat for other rape crisis services. Now, I personally think that councils, local authorities should provide spaces for everyone who's been raped. It doesn't matter who they are. But within that, they must recognise the need for single-sex spaces and for the fact that rape is almost entirely a crime, well, it is a crime entirely perpetrated by men with mostly female victims. Our position on this, I think, fair to say, Joanne, remains open. We're still establishing Bera's Place. We haven't yet plumbed the depth of need that's out there. Our numbers are increasing all the time. It's something we will keep in mind for the future, but we hope that our example, our support, the network we've set up, the legal advice we're giving to other organisations means that in the future we will see these organisations moving back into the spaces they once held. However, that cannot happen while the Scottish Government still demands a funding model where you have to say how you will be trans-inclusive. So we have to keep pressuring our local politicians, because a lot of this is local authority, and our national politicians to stop that nonsense. So we're going to draw this session to a close now. Thank you so much. I want to say a huge thank you to Anne-Marie Ward. I think people's personal testimonies are always moving, and yeah. And to Kate Barker from LGB Alliance. And to me. But thank you to all of you for being such a great audience, and a huge, huge thank you to the fabulous Alloa women.